at that time, just after he had come to Princeton. It's funny because to convince me, I was like, I'm not that interested in policy, and they were surprised because they'd seen me at all the seminars, right? And they were like, as they were trying to persuade me to do this policy fellowship, I was like, I gave that reaction, and they were like, what are you interested in? And I was like, interested in ethics. And they're like, oh, you can study ethics. Ethics is a part of policy. I then, realized much later that that was like actually, in a way, a big fat lie, because it was not at all what was part of the policy classes that I then had to take. I had to take separate ethics classes and then contemplate why ethics was not embedded in a more meaningful way in the policy process. But anyway, that is not the topic of conversation for today. I first want to start by thanking you all for coming to this. It is harder and harder to marshal ourselves, I think, after years of the pandemic, to listen to somebody purely through Zoom. So I'm grateful to have you here, and I really look forward to hearing your thoughts and reactions afterwards. You would have seen one title for my talk from the ad, but another title that you might contemplate is Beyond the Honest Broker and Towards Scholar Agents of Change. I'm going to go through, so this is me, also a Canada Research Chair, which I'm very grateful for. And yeah, I do have a lab conveniently named Chan's Lab, which is like, can be very thankful to the folks who came up with that acronym before I colonized it with my name. I'm going to start just by grounding us in this dual challenge of the climate and biodiversity crisis, where we've got trajectories that are beyond worrying and still on the same problematic trajectory, where we know that we've got to turn around these global temperature scenarios, turn around the emission scenarios, turn around this loss of biodiversity, all within a couple of decades. So that's the problem as we're in it. I'm going to roughly follow this, although I'm not going to, I haven't done that great a job of updating the table of contents, I now realize. Anyway, we've covered the problem. I'm going to explain it a bit more deeply through this IPBES global assessment. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we're doing. I'm going to take you through an argument about how we as scientists have approached the problem of engaging with the public. I'm going to make an argument that we need to do things a little differently. And I'm going to give some examples and point a way forward. So IPBES, or the IPBES, we call it IPBES from the inside because it's multilingual friendly. The way you say I and P and B is different in lots of different languages, but pretty much all languages have some version of something that like sounds like those letters when you string them together as IPBES. The global assessment was a follow-up to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in an official government capacity. When this major report launched in May of 2019, it attracted a lot of media attention, for which can be grateful. What led the stories really was this startling statistic that 1 million species face pretty imminent extinction as a direct result of human activities. It involved 500, just about, of the world's leading experts, actually bigger than the 450 figure here. Documented this troubling decline of nature and nature's contributions to people. And so what I'm going to do over the next few slides is just walk you through some of those findings to paint a fuller picture of what we know about this climate and ecological crisis and how those various pieces interact. First, through the lens of this assessment. This figure is the one that effectively gave rise to that 1 million species estimate, where different levels of threat are in different colors in each of these bars, representing a different group of living organisms. So as you go down, you've got a higher and higher proportion of species that are at higher risks of extinction. So down here, we've got sharks and rays, and below that, we're at approximately 30% or more of all of these groups are at risk of extinction. Not to say that less than 30, right, with the crustaceans and the mammals is not also troubling. Each of those are at greater than 25%. These are IUCN Red List categories for those who care about these things. And of course, it's not only the species that we should be concerned about, but before I pivot there, this is a pair of graphs with different timescales. So here we've got like the last 500 or so years on the left, and then a much more recent timescale of just since 1980. On the left is cumulative proportion of species driven to extinction, where obviously higher is worse, and you can see the really stark increase in that over time. And then this one, down is problematic, and even over these really compressed timescales, you can see striking declines in some groups like amphibians and especially corals. It comes home to us in all kinds of different ways. I confess I don't know that much about the stories that are compelling in Manitoba, but here we worry about populations like the southern resident orcas, a population which I think it's only 72 that remain now. It's a distinct population. They feed on different organisms than the transient orcas that are not doing so badly, and most calves are not surviving. Back in 2018, I believe, one female made the news because she had a stillborn baby and then proceeded for 17 days to parade that baby's carcass around on her nose, so she didn't dive, and and stayed at the surface, just like keeping that infant up there at the surface of the water, as if maybe it might start breathing again, or maybe in a way to like show off to us what we had done to them. The coral reefs are a really tragic story. I had the good fortune of being in the Caribbean for the first time in a long time this last winter. We took a catamaran ride thanks to my brother, who's a sailor, and we asked the deckhand how the corals were doing before we got into the water. And I was like, have you had any coral bleaching events? He was like, no, the corals are great. And I got in the water, and this is what they looked like insofar as you could even see structures like this. There wasn't a living coral in sight, and he just couldn't tell the difference between the tunicates and the sponges that there were still a few of and corals, because they've been dead now for so long there that they don't even know what a healthy reef looks like. And that same saga is playing out in lots of places around the world. As I said, it's not just about the critters, it's also what we derive in the way of benefits from those creatures. So 91 of 107 leading global crop types relies on animal pollination, and that's just one of 18 categories of nature's contributions to people or ecosystem services. And when you look across those categories, recognizing that there may be multiple metrics of how those ecosystem services are doing across the globe, thinking about both the ecosystem's capacity as well as how much we are making use of that capacity, we see this really troubling picture of like almost all declines, either straight down or this like variable decrease in orange. There are only 3 here, ecosystem services, that have partial indicators, some indicators of good news. So not straight up good news, but variable good news. But none of these are about measures of ecological integrity, as it turns out. These are the proportion of arable lands that are grown for biofuels and the proportion that are grown for crops, etc. So these are measures of human intervention in systems more than ecosystems' capacity to provide what we need from them. And this plays out in all kinds of ways. When we buy hardwood products for floors or furniture, it results in logging, much of which is illegal logging. Even if it's legal, it may be unsustainable. giving rise to landslides that may ruin people's villages at the cost of human lives and their houses. Also degrading habitat that is necessary for forest-dependent birds like this white-ruffed manakin, and putting sediment into waterways that both causes eutrophication in freshwater and also can undermine coral reefs and other coastal ecosystems, potentially hundreds, if not even thousands of kilometers away. So all these systems are connected. And when we look, you know what, I'm actually going to skip this. I don't need to go into that detail here. I will just point out, though, that being carbon neutral is not going to solve all of our problems. So the environmental crisis has been wearing a different name for the last decade. We've been thinking about it as a climate crisis for the most part. That's what you'll hear about in the news. And there's way more searches about climate change than there is about biodiversity or any other element of the broader environmental crisis. But when you look at the drivers of degradation in any of either terrestrial, freshwater, or marine systems, climate change is not number one in any of those systems. In fact, it's not even number two in any of those systems. It is the third most important driver of loss and degradation, where the direct destruction of habitat is the first in most ecosystems, but in marine, it's the direct exploitation, so the taking of organisms. Now, to further elaborate on that point, it's important to recognize that there is no ecologically free energy. Every form, even these like most renewable forms of energy, all have their problems from an ecological perspective. So dams present major problems to freshwater ecosystems, changing the flow regimes, which are so important to so many of the creatures that live within them. They're not even greenhouse gas neutral in many cases, because the flooding of these reservoirs causes vegetation in those valleys to rot in ways that the methane can actually contribute substantially to climate change. And we've got the clearing of habitats and the road building on sensitive slopes to build these rows of wind turbines where the winds are strongest, which causes a lot of destruction to those sensitive habitats, as well as posing a risk to migratory birds and bats and other creatures. And then similarly, in terms of the habitat taken up by solar farms, as well as the mining that requires. So no ecologically free energy. And I'm going to make a kind of contentious argument to say, and I'm going to be, I've got an op-ed that I'm going to be shopping around in a couple of days on that. I actually think that it's a good thing that energy is limited. That at the moment, that if we had abundant, cheap energy, we would only dig ourselves a deeper grave. What I mean by that is we use energy in such ecologically perverse ways currently that are encouraged by economic and political systems, that if we had more energy, we would probably just do more harm. So let me give you an example of that. The Maine lobster fishery actually doesn't really produce shellfish so much as it consumes herring. It takes about 3 pounds of forage fish as bait, especially herring, in order to produce 1 pound of lobster. Now, that sounds crazy enough as it is, but when you recognize that lobsters are actually among the least nutrient dense of all the shellfish coming out of this system, and herring are among the most nutrient dense, what you see is then that actually this lobster fishery, which the system has been moving towards, as lobster prices have gone up, as it's seen as a luxury good, this lobster fishery is actually a net deficit of nutrients for human consumption. It is consuming far more vitamin B12, far more protein, iron, like across the board. It is, and especially essential fatty acids, where Small fish like this are among the most important sources of this vital nutrient, and we are losing large amounts to the production of these species that are consumed for luxury purposes. So just one example of the kind of madness that we are producing. All right, that's enough of the depressing side of this. The EPOS Global Assessment had 6 chapters. The first was an introduction. The second, was the status and trends of nature, nature's contributions to people, and the drivers of change of those. And that's mostly what I've been telling about right now. I've been walking through these 3 parts of that chapter. For those familiar with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, this chapter 2 is effectively the assessment in a nutshell, updated by 15 years. And then there was a whole bunch more. So progress and prognosis towards the Sustainable Development Goals and goals for biodiversity, scenarios and quantitative models about the future, and pathways towards a sustainable future, options, obstacles, and opportunities. Now, if 5 sounds like similar to 4, and you're wondering why the heck would you have both of those chapters? The difference is that 4 is those scenarios and models that are quantitatively specified. Now, if you know much about modeling, you'll know that that means these are effectively projections from the current day. They are business as usual and small variations. And the reason that chapter 5 existed was because it was anticipated from the beginning that chapter 4 would yield no sustainable pathways, no pathways where we were on course to achieve sustainability in its full form, producing enough water, clean water, enough food, doing so in a way compatible with a livable climate. So chapter 5 was created with an idea of considering deeper change towards sustainability and possibilities that had not yet been expressed in the form of these quantitatively specified scenarios and models. So what that looked like, I'll say I had the pleasure of leading this chapter 5. I say it's a pleasure. It was actually quite painful, but it's a pleasure in relative terms because I cannot imagine having spent 3 years of my life documenting the decline without, or looking at all these scenarios and models that were full of bad news without considering these more positive possibilities. What we took in chapter 5 was a backcasting approach. And what I mean by that was that instead of starting from the current day and imagining trajectories from there that were somewhat like the current trajectory, but a little different, what we did instead was we rooted both in the present and also in a future where we had succeeded. And then we asked the question as to what kinds of changes could get you from A to B. Turns out it's a lot of changes. We broke down the problem into these 6 different foci. So recognizing that sustainability on Earth includes at least these 6 different challenges. So 1, balancing food provision from the oceans and coasts with nature protection, meeting climate goals while still maintaining space and capacity for nature and for nature to provide for people. Continuing to resource cities, which are growing, and still maintain sufficient nature within them in order to make lives meaningful within those places. Feeding humanity from terrestrial agriculture without degrading the nature on land, conserving and restoring nature on land without just kicking people off it, actually letting them continue to enjoy the fruits of those labors. And finally, maintaining fresh water for both nature and people. What you might notice right away is that we've taken a deeply interconnected system and we've carved it up into 6 pieces. Now, we didn't do that because we thought that that was a good approach, but so much as we had to, because the literatures were divided in these ways. There weren't really any literatures that considered all 6 of these challenges at the same time. We were lucky that most of them were actually considering a kind of nexus of goals, right? So not just feeding nature, but feeding nature while still feeding humanity while still maintaining nature. What we found, though, was that the interconnection was kind of obvious. So there were scenarios for each of these. For example, scenarios for meeting the Paris 1.5-degree targets that entailed massive afforestation, planting lots of trees where they frankly don't belong ecologically, which would have huge implications for our ability to feed people as well as for nature conservation. But those hadn't really been thoroughly considered in these scenarios where they were relying heavily upon that carbon storage and sequestration. Similarly, the sustainable agriculture literature was full of ideas for how you could feed humanity without degrading nature on land necessarily, but those often entailed massive inputs of both fertilizers, pesticides, and water, which all collectively reduced water supplies and contaminated them with both pollutants as well as sediment, which undermined this goal, as well as I said before, this more distant one on the coast. So deep interconnectivity meant that the only kind of change that seemed to be appropriate or capable of getting us from A to B was transformative, whole system change, including economic, social, institutional, technological, and behavioral systems. Changing how we grow food, shifting values, goals, and paradigms, and requiring widespread societal action. We expressed all this in the form of this diagram of the levers and leverage points of transformative change. The levers being governance interventions, the leverage points being those points in social ecological, socio-economic systems that are most important to intervene at. Now, I don't know, this talk isn't about the levers and the leverage points, but I'll just say briefly here that what might look completely unsurprising and really obvious in these very short, like 2 to 8 word representations, actually are more different than what you might have heard previously, more nuanced than could be conveyed in these few words. So I'll give you a couple of examples. This one here of reducing total consumption and waste. The IPCC has never actually come out and said this. In fact, they've kind of said the opposite in the sense that they have baked into their scenarios a continued escalation of demand and production of energy. That is the opposite, in a sense, of what we need to be conveying, which is that if we continue to grow our consumption at the rates that we're doing it, it's impossible, virtually impossible to imagine sustainable outcomes. So similarly, while there has elsewhere been lots of talk about how to reduce consumption, there hasn't been a lot of, or rather, there is still a lot of debate about how to get there. And so we represented that in terms of thinking about how visions of a good life are embedded in not just social norms, but also in economic and political systems, and how those might need to shift in order to realize this goal of reducing total consumption and waste. I think I will move on from here. Oh, there's a ton more to say. I spent a long time on that figure and thinking. What I want to move to is to thinking about, as scholars, what do we do in the face of that context? In the face of a planetary crisis, the likes of which we have never seen collectively. Well, what we have been doing is science engagement in 2 major forms. Science communication, which is talking broadly, presenting, tweeting, right? All that stuff to a diversity of audiences, including journalists, and engaging with policymakers and practitioners to provide specific input from our expertise to help improve decision-making. I was told in my early career, that's how you do it. That is the way we can be useful to the world. And it's really summed up by this idea and this book, I think, by Roger Pielke Jr. of The Honest Broker, where he argued that issue advocacy is deeply problematic, that when scientists campaign for particular kinds of changes, they undermine their credibility and undermine the platform upon which science stands and has a role in the world. He argued that the only appropriate way to engage was as an honest broker, where we check our values and our visions, our opinions at the door, and convey the science in an objective fashion. Even where we started using terms that might sound very different from broker, like science leadership, we effectively followed that same approach. So here's a paper from 2009 where a bunch of the Smith Fellows from the US, the Society for Conservation Biology, and I wrote a paper outlining what conservation science leadership might look like. And we identified two different forms of it. The first, shaping science to be more useful, potentially, and integrating it into decision-making and discourse. It's the same stuff, right? Still honest brokerage. Arguably, this strand of thinking became even more embedded through the adoption of an economic route to policy relevance. So I mentioned that policy program that I did at Stanford or at Princeton through the Woodrow Wilson School. Their policy analysis courses were economics. That was what we were taught as the science of policymaking. And we weren't the only ones. Like, apparently, this is the norm across all of the public policy schools across North America. And it's the same logic that was embedded in pretty major turns from ecology adjacent fields. So as conservation embraced the notion of ecosystem services and spawned this new field associated with that, as well as this like collection of pieces like this TEEB, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, ecologists and natural scientists learned to fetishize incremental change. We were taught that if you wanted to have real change in the world, if you wanted to be relevant to policymaking, you had to express that science in the form of small incremental changes from the status quo. That if you weren't doing that, you weren't economically credible, you weren't relevant. So in a series of bubbles, I'd argue that kind of 20th century thinking, although it continued on into the early part of the 21st century, about science engagement was that we should convey information with objectivity, suppressing all of the rest of these in order to potentially achieve incremental change without us having agency. The agency was entirely in the decision maker's hands. That's where agency resides in this model. All we could do is provide information for them. If those decision makers happen to disbelieve science or even demonize it for societal problems, we were at a loss as to what we could do about that. A great example of this, and when I say great, I mean like actually really a really good example in that it does good in the world, is the Natural Capital Project. During my postdoc at Stanford with Gretchen Daly, I had the pleasure to do some of the analyses that helped to launch this really important project. It's a collaboration of Stanford University, the Nature Conservancy, and WWF, and then the University of Minnesota joining a little later, which is wholly founded upon this model of providing information for the sake of potentially inspiring incremental change for biodiversity and ecosystem services. Their main products are these modeling products that bake in the logic of this like small changes from the status quo. I truly believe that these kinds of efforts are deeply needed in many places. I also believe that they are by no means sufficient to confront the crisis that we find ourselves in. Personally, I tried to do a few different things over the course of my career. Joining the global assessment as a coordinating lead author was one of those. It was, as I said, kind of a painful journey. When we got to the end of it and we had this flurry of media activity, it felt great at first. I was talking to multiple journalists a day for like every day for the first month. But eventually I got tired of those conversations because the part about solutions became like it was always the last bit. The, even if it wasn't the last part of the conversation, it was the last part of the article, right? There'd be an article that was like 6 or 7 paragraphs long. The first 5 or 6 of them would be about the problems, and then one tiny little paragraph about the solutions. There's no way to convey the complexity of the path forward in one tiny little newspaper column paragraph. And more deeply, I found that when I got a chance to actually speak to policymakers, I thought that was my chance to be policy relevant. I figured that these were legislators at the House of Commons Standing Committee on Sustainable Development. These were legislators who wanted to hear what I had to say in order to actually put it into action. And what I discovered in a story that I tell at this blog post on the Cosphere website was that that wasn't the purpose at all. I was there for the sake of political theater. I was there for the sake of a soundbite, being grateful to the government for their recent announcement of $1 billion spent on conservation. That was my purpose, not to help them rethink the laws that govern this country to make our nation and the world more sustainable. It became clear to me, and this work is much more complex than this one figure, but represents, this figure is of the 8 different meta theories where Harald Eister, who did his PhD with me, reviewed 86 different theories of human action change and summarized those in these original meta theories based on common assumptions that are made about what drives changes in human action. What we found was that there is a heavy reliance in certain fields on very particular meta theories, the economic and the structural ones. And without going into the detail of this work, which is published in the Annual Review of Environment and Resources, I'll just say they effectively embody this theory of change, that it is our role as academics to provide that information to decision makers who will act with the long-term public interest in mind. And I just don't buy it. I've been through that cycle long enough to see that that often doesn't happen. There are 3 big developments that have happened over the last few years that I think make space for a new way forward. And I'm going to go through each of those in turn. One is that attitudes among scientists have changed radically. Back in 2003, Locke et al. Published a paper in Bioscience where they showed that on average, scientists disagreed, or possibly some of them strongly disagreed, that we should actively advocate for particular causes. In 2014, in a paper published in Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment, with Gerald Singh as lead author, we found a very starkly different picture. And that was confirmed in an even further shift in 2019 with a broader and more international sample. People are thinking differently about the role that scientists can play in bringing their opinions, not nestled in to their information, but often separate. We can talk about that later. A second really important development is the embracing and invitation of social sciences into these interdisciplinary fields that include the natural sciences. Social sciences have long been reflexive about their positionality as researchers, how who we are shapes how we view the world, what we think are interesting questions, how we decide on the evidence that in favor or against. These questions of positionality, these processes of reflexivity, brought a recognition that we actually are not objective, and that when we pretend we are, that actually produces more problems than being open about our subjectivity. And then there are these provocative training programs. I've been part of several of them. Environmental Leadership Program, the Leopold Leadership Program, which morphed into the Earth Leadership Program. And these programs have introduced to a generation of concerned academics a whole bunch of troublesome ideas in the form of the crucial importance of visioning from Donella Meadows when thinking about sustainability problems, in the form of seeing ourselves as agents of change in systems and in institutions through the book Switch, and in broader literatures about leadership, where values are argued to be central, that strong leaders are those who are clear and compelling about their values, and then who live their lives and structure their business in ways that are consistent with those values. And then we add to that mix of those three societal developments, this growing recognition of this planetary crisis. And what we've got is a different recipe for engagement suited for the 21st century. Still bringing information, and still doing that in a way where we do our best to check our biases, but also sometimes separately being very frank about our subjectivity and our opinions, being clear about our values, and being ambitious and bold about our visions, and realizing, seizing our agency for change in a way that seeks not just incremental change, but transformative change. I don't know what to call this exactly, toying with ideas of scholar agent of change and this little moniker of small planet hero, which is at the heart of CoSphere, this initiative that I have founded and I'm still running. I want to give a few really brief examples. Amanda Vincent in her work with Project Seahorse, where they didn't exactly change CITES, but they changed a lot about how it operated, bringing small marine life into consideration where they had been ignored completely at CITES up until then. Other examples like moves against the suppression and misuse of science. I was involved in some of these efforts as a postdoc at Stanford, where we had this science and policy program that brought thousands of young scientists into this movement to decry the Bush administration's misuse, suppression, and abuse of science, which got folded into the Union of Concerned Scientists Scientific Integrity project. The same kind of thing happened a few years later in Canada with the Harper government, which led to this death of evidence movement, which has then yielded this wonderful new NGO, Evidence for Democracy, or E4D. And then Elena Bennett, one of my close colleagues, who is both planting and also celebrating the seeds of good Anthropocenes in the form of these different kinds of bottom-up approaches that could become transformative if they kept growing, kept scaling up. These are different kinds of interventions. They're ones that move beyond helping individuals with their private actions, whether by talking to individual people, talking to journalists, or talking to decision makers. They move into these realms of directly trying to change systems and in signaling our values and living and acting in accordance with those. And it's this triad of private, system changing, and social signaling action that where we have the opportunity to scale up from small scale change to big scale system change, which is necessarily going to have to involve changing infrastructure and other materials, changing our competencies, and also the meanings that we use to understand and make sense of the world. This figure comes out of a paper that Rumi Naito, a PhD student with Jiaying Zhao, and I led. And so I encourage you to check that out in sustainability science. And that all brings me to CoSphere, where our vision for CoSphere is we're a community for collective action. We want to bring system science into connection with real-world solutions, equipping people with knowledge and tools to orient their actions towards transformative change. And so a part of that, for those who are experts already, a part of that is to bring them into places where they can help, where they can really leverage their knowledge meaningfully, building both a platform and a community to enable action. Our pledge, we're asking people to sign on to this, which is effectively consistent with what the 132 nations who negotiated every word of the Summary for Policymakers of that global assessment signed on to, that deep system change is necessary. And we'd love you to join in that movement with us. I want to, I realize that I have been talking for almost 40 minutes now. I want to introduce you to a few of the pieces that we're pushing on right now. One of them is really centering this third leverage point of unleashing values and action, where we recognize that the values that people are exposed to may be actually quite different from the ones that they feel. We may have a problem of a silent majority, where lots of folks have these ideas that seem to be in contradiction to what they see around them, that leads them to be quiet, not only in online spaces, but also elsewhere about those values. Where we argue a first step is to get people to express their visions for a better world and the values that they hold that go along with those in ways that starts to change our collective perception of what is normal. And so we're working to empower the youth movement and other concerned citizens by bringing experts and informed others into conversation also with the many NGOs that are part of our coalition who are doing really great work, and others who are doing really great work towards solving this crisis. I'm going to actually skip over these two slides because they're a little more complexity. What this involves is a series of workshops, both with students and then also with teachers, as we'll be doing soon, where we get people together to understand an issue and then express their opinions in the form of their visions for a better future, what they see as obstacles to realizing that vision, and then possible social and system changes to realize that, to overcome those obstacles. Where they then, after posting about that in some public place, we then collectively go and search for other people's posts in order to amplify their voices and to give them the sense that somebody is listening and we care and we can help refine your ideas, where we then go away and reflect and grow as a movement. One of the representations of that is through an Instagram account, not actually this one shown here, but another one where we have represented a range of people's visions and impediments, perceived impediments and plans forward. This actually was idea of unleash values was embedded in the way that I transformed my undergraduate class. It was really hard work, but it was amazing to see how students came to life when, instead of being taught only about the problems where their opinions were never really requested, it was all about their visions. Everything was centered around their visions such that they could weave the science and action together with their own values. Two more little pieces that we're working on that I hope embody this idea of transformative change. You've probably all heard of carbon offsets. Arguably now you probably also know that they have largely enabled greenwashing and land grabbing. Not that they haven't also done some good in some isolated cases, but that is unfortunately a major effect they've had. Biodiversity offsets are coming, and that's going to present a whole new slew of challenges to land-based communities, including Indigenous peoples. Our plan is to express a range, a set of concrete lessons that we've learned in the form of a kind of manifesto about what would be the only acceptable way to proceed with these land and sea-based offsets. in a way that would entirely raise the bar for accepted means of offsetting carbon, and that would effectively ensure a cooperative governance of local communities and Indigenous people in maintaining not just nature, but also people's interactions with nature. Finally, this is the third. We want to help connect those communities in tangible ways in order to help people launch projects through fora like EarthNet. So EarthNet, one of our founding partners, they imagine to start 10 million projects to address the climate and ecological crisis. They want to help people through social networking, connect with the people who have knowledge, who can actually help with their ideas, to get their ideas off the ground, launch them, execute them, and then also convey their learning about those. At the moment, academics are not in this space. They have a lot of NGOs who are talking, and not that many who have the capacity to actually also engage with other people's projects. We have a huge community of academics who have expertise that could help to make those projects successful and also not yield a bunch of perverse outcomes. We need to get on there in order to enable people to benefit from that knowledge. So CoSphere and EarthNet are going to be partnering to make that easy and enjoyable so that an academic, an expert in this space, climate, environment, etc., social justice, can come onto the site just with their bio and then immediately be fed a string of projects that are directly relevant for their expertise so that they can weigh in with insights and connections and then receive like badges that attest to those important contributions that are making to those ideas. To wrap up, we'd love for you to join the CoSphere Coalition. If you're interested in any of these particular projects that we're running of Unleash Values, this kind of education-oriented one, this offset reset and the Sci on EarthNet, then we'd love to engage with you. Also, we'd love for you to bring others in who you think might be interested in doing this. And if you know anybody who has cash lying around, then we are always interested in those kinds of tips as well. That's how you can find us on social media. And it's this website, or sorry, this email that would be the best to contact us at, because I am currently suffering from a broken email software. So to wrap up, we need deep change now. Academics and all of us can engage to help to bring about the change we need. 21st century engagement is bold, it's creative, it's experimental. It requires failing and learning from those failures. And we can change our academic institutions to encourage that so that those institutions are no longer part of the problem, but actually part of the solution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kai, for that. I mean, I think there's a lot we could talk about. We could probably spend all night talking about any number of things from that. But if people have specific, can you hear me? You can hear me? If people have specific things, they might want to put into the chat. If you have specific questions, please do so, and we'll let Kai address some of them. So maybe I will start just to say thank you. That was really inspiring. I wonder, Kai, if you have any thoughts about the way in which, I mean, I think a lot of us are coming from a humanities perspective. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about the way in which specifically academics who are maybe not scientists, what you think their role is, or what their role should be in addressing some of these issues and going forward with some of the things that you talked about. I'm just.
Did he log off? Okay,
Oh, yeah,
he's in the waiting room.
Okay, there.
Okay, I let him back in.
Hi, Kai, are you back with us? Uh, I'm now I've got him. Sorry. I'm
Okay.
gonna make him co-host again so he can actually talk to us. Hi, Kai, sorry about that. I think you're back with us now. Can we hear you?
Yes, that was really bad timing. Yeah, Zoom
This is
just
how
quit
technology
on me.
works.
Yeah, seriously. Uh,
So so I'm just encouraging people to throw some questions into the chat, but I was just wondering about what you see as the role of, so I think a lot of us here are from the sort of humanities world. And
yeah.
what you think, to be a good academic citizen coming from a humanities perspective, whether you think there are some specific things that you think we should be stepping up to do.
Well, a part of, I mean, gosh, it's so hard, right? Like I the the first complaint that I hear from folks in the humanities is they hate to be told by scientists what scientists want them to do, right? So I'm like, I feel anxious about answering that question. Um, I, I mean, I think that what folks in the humanities have been doing really well is to articulate this moment that we're in, this challenge, this crisis that we're in ways that resonates with people. And so I like, I mean, I guess what I'd say on that front is like, you know, keep learning about the science in ways that you can relay that to people in the form of the ethical dilemmas that it presents, as well as in any number of literary and artistic endeavors, right? Like that's the job that the humanities have always done. And, and so it just needs to be coupled with that ongoing learning about this super complex social and ecological crisis that we're in.
Yeah, thank you so much. Nancy, I think you wanted to maybe ask a question.
Um, I'm allowed to unmute my video.
Yeah.
I guess I'm going to change your protocol, Neil. Okay. Yeah. Thanks so much for your talk, Dr. Shan. I was wondering, in view of what you said about theories of human action, what are your thoughts on the difference between public intellectualism and activism? Like, is it possible to be both, or does one have a particular set of risks or higher stakes? Can you kind of meditate on the differences there and how academics can find themselves limited in terms of self-definitions?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a really good question. It's at the heart of that logic of the honest broker, right? The logic being that we can't mix those two things. You cannot be a public intellectual and also an activist, because the moment that you are seen in the public as having opinions about what we should do, then it's going to taint your ability to speak on behalf of like objective science. And I've actually written a fair bit about this, dating back a while, and 15 years, where I argue that, this is a real concern. The concern that about the misuse of this privileged platform that we have as scientists, that we can absolutely undermine that platform through our own actions, but that there are lots of examples of people who have managed to do both in a way where they disentangle them, right? They don't try to do them exactly at the same time, but rather to speak in one way at some times, and then in a very explicit way to stop speaking in that way and to like don another hat and to speak in another way. And so I try to do this when I'm talking to journalists. I'll say like, okay, you've asked me a question that requires science. So let me give you my most unbiased take on the science. But also, like, here's my opinion, and here's why I think that way as an individual. And, you know, like it doesn't always, I'm sure that not everybody appreciates that. And not everybody can see that like moment of me like taking off the one hat and putting on the other hat. But I think that's the best we can do to manage that. Like our opinions are shaped by the science. They're not like, we're not just radicals that just like come in here and then try to like misuse the science. We have a really elaborate system to prevent that, right, of peer review. And so if you're paying attention, you'll see that like lots of folks have managed to be very vocal about the changes that they would like to see in the world, while they also strive super hard to maintain an unbiased practice of science. And Amanda Vincent is a great example of that. On the one hand, campaigning for the conservation of seahorses, but also doing really great fundamental science research on those seahorses.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, could you just take a moment to talk about and maybe promote your lab and some of the work that some of the people in that lab are doing? Just tell us a little bit about what that lab is exactly and what, what are the research programs of some of the people there?
Yeah, absolutely. So the lab, as you would have seen from that first one, is called the Connected Human and Natural Systems Lab. And we do research at the intersection of the natural sciences and the social sciences in the context of this eco-climate crisis and the need for transformative change. We weave in values throughout. And so that's like the ethicist in me, right? Like bringing that part of ethics into the science and social science that we do. We're working on problems of rewilding, which we conceive of in a very broad way. So that for us includes both helping the Okanagan Nation Alliance to potentially return grizzly bears to landscapes in BC, as well as and other partners to do that kind of thing, as well as helping to restore ecosystems in, sorry, let me backtrack on that. We're not helping to return bears. We're studying the social interactions about that, right? So helping them to make decisions about that. We're not moving bears. But we're also studying urban ecosystems and understanding the many ways that we simplify those, such that, for example, as one hypothesis, if we stop supplementing so much food for scavengers who are almost exclusively, all of them seem to be generalist nest predators, maybe we could really remove this major simplifying force on these ecosystems in urban settings, where we're used to these systems being dominated by just a few species of sparrows and like starlings and crows. Maybe we could actually have them be much more vibrant with a wider variety of living organisms, which then will play their own ecological roles in these spaces. I don't know how much more to say. We're also doing work in marine ecosystems, thinking about cumulative effects, but
Well, yeah,
yeah,
it
thanks,
sounds
Liz.
sounds like I mean, I was just looking at the list of people. You've got quite a roster of people working. I mean, it sounds like you've got a lot of energy and a lot of good thinking going
It's a
on.
great group.
So I mean, I think we're winding down in terms of time. I guess I would just maybe throw one more thought out there at you. It's something that you've already mentioned, but I would maybe get you to expand on a little bit, and that's the role of indigeneity in the sorts of issues that you're talking about, and how you integrate the perspectives of Indigenous people, how you integrate Indigenous teachings, how you consult with Indigenous leaders and Indigenous people in these various environments and ecosystems in different locations. How do you approach those kinds of issues in your work, and what advice might you have?
Yeah, thank you for that question too. I mean, this is absolutely crucial. The Indigenous people across the planet are the primary guardians for lands and waters in ways that have been unrecognized and trampled for generations through colonialism and its more modern forms. So we're doing some research directly with First Nations in Canada, and in other cases we're starting to build those bridges. Every project that we do we see partly through that lens, and but cognizant of not wanting to tap into those groups for time that they can't afford to contribute unless we have a really meaningful way that we can contribute to their objectives. we strive to contribute to reconciliation and decolonization in a whole bunch of different ways. So let me give you one really kind of abstract example. We're champions of the idea of relational values, which is a notion of a way of understanding values that you can think of in the context of intrinsic and instrumental values. So in environmental policy and discourse contexts, outside of ethics, values are understood to be either what nature, say, does for us, those are the instrumental values, or the intrinsic value of nature. So why nature is value unto itself, separate from any benefits that it might provide for humanity. Up until 2013, that was like the leading understanding, that when we talk about values in this context of the environment, we're talking about one of those two. Having worked with Terry Satterfield and adjacent to and with a variety of Indigenous groups, including from Hawaii, we had tried to take on the understanding of values that is really different from that, right? For example, when we talked to Hawaiian First Nations groups or First Peoples groups about ecosystem services, they were like, don't talk to us about what nature is going to do for us. For us, that is not meaningful unless we're also talking about the responsibilities that we have to nature. And so what they were doing was saying to us, like, don't talk to us about instrumental values. Tell us about the values about the relationship we have. And so that notion that, like, we don't only have values about what we derive and then about what these things are separately. We have values about what are right relationships, what are appropriate ways that we relate to nature and that we relate to people where nature is an intermediary. And so those are what we call relational values. The whole logic of relational values was very much inspired by Indigenous thinking, right? Almost every Indigenous group that I know of thinks of the world principally in relational terms, that the relationships precede the things, right? And that's a way of thinking that I think we can learn a lot from in the scientific arena. And it's been a privilege and a pleasure to be able to bring that thinking that is so deeply Indigenous, really, to embed it into, for example, IPBES in their conceptual framework, so that now all of the ecosystem assessments that are done through and adjacent to IPBES, they're all considering this third way of understanding values in a way that makes space for Indigenous ways of understanding the world. So we try for those very concrete partnerships, as well as the looser, working towards common objectives, as well as these conceptual reorientations that make space for those ways of thinking and knowing.
That's really interesting. I think that's really useful. Well, I think we're at the end now. So I will, on behalf of everyone who is muted, thank you for your great talk. It has been recorded, so you can certainly contact me by email. I will post it somewhere where people can get access to it if they're interested in reviewing it, or if someone couldn't be with us and wants to see it. So thank you so much, Professor Chan, and thank you all for coming. I will look forward, hopefully, to seeing you all at future events. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been great to talk with you all.
Thanks, Neil. Thank you, Dr. Chen.